You're listening to Below the Surface, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, DNA ID, Scene of the Crime, Zodiac Speaking, Beyond Bizarre True Crime, Campus Killings, and Killer Communications. All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
A missing person, a strange death, a vanished vehicle, a series of unanswerable questions. In so many true crime mysteries, the answers remain elusive. But in many instances, the clues lead right to the water's edge, and sometimes the truth lies below the surface. Welcome back to Below the Surface. I'm your host, Olivia, and today I'm unpacking the case of 24-year-old Louisa Ioannidis, whose body was found floating in Darebin Creek in the Melbourne Australian suburbs on October 11th of 2011. While her death was ruled an accidental drowning, her brother Tass believes that she was murdered and has spent the last 15 years urging Victorian authorities to reopen her case. In 2024, new evidence was brought to the Australian public, but was it enough to reclassify Louisa's death as a homicide? Let's dive in. So who is Louisa? She was born in Greece on February the 15th, 1987. She experienced more trauma in her 24 short years than most people see in their whole lifetime. To understand why there is such discrepancy between what the police think about her death and what her family thinks, we need to go back to the beginning of her story. Louisa and her sister were the product of their mother Helen's second marriage to a Libyan man that she met in 1985. Their half-brother Tass lived with his biological father in Australia after Helen remarried in 1986. While Louisa spent her first few years in Greece, her family decided to relocate to Melbourne in 1990 for better work opportunities. They bought a house in Reservoir, which is a suburb just outside of Melbourne, and over Louisa's elementary school years, her parents argued constantly about their living situation. Louisa's father, who has not been named in any public records, wanted to move the family back to Libya. And while they had visited his home country several times over the course of Louisa's young life, Libya faced ongoing political instability and violent conflicts, and Helen had no desire to subject her young daughters to that. By Tass's accounts, their compromise was to build a vacation house in Libya to visit with family, but they spent most of their time in Melbourne. When Louisa was 10 years old, her father announced that their vacation house had been completed and that they were going on a big family holiday to celebrate. They would spend a week in the new Libyan house and then move on for a week in Greece to visit Helen's family before returning to Australia. But when they arrived in Libya, Louisa's father handed Helen a box. Inside was a burqa that he demanded she put on because they were not going to Greece or back to Australia. They were staying in Libya permanently. Helen disagreed and said that she was taking her daughters back home. Her husband made it clear to her that she could leave whenever she wanted, but Libyan law meant that she no longer had any custody rights. The children were his and he was going to keep them there. After several futile months of trying to get help from the Australian and the Greek embassies, Helen's only option was to leave her daughters in Libya and go back to Australia, where she then spent 2 years raising funds to pay the fees required to regain full custody of the children. During that time, some reports allege Louisa's father enrolled the girls in school where they experienced intense bullying from students and teachers for being foreign. And other reports allege their father was physically and verbally abusive towards his daughters. When Helen returned to Libya in 1998, she succeeded in gaining full custody, though it came at a very steep price. It exhausted every penny that she had, and as part of the custody agreement, Helen and the girls were not allowed to leave the country, and they had to continue residing in the house with Louisa's father. In retaliation for defying him, Louisa's father forced Helen and his daughters into the smallest part of the house. He bricked up a wall so they had no access to the rest of the mansion. Under Libyan law, Helen was unable to work, and with her Australian funds exhausted, she and her daughters had no income, aside from their father's very small amount of child support. For the next 2 years, Louisa lived in abject poverty. Their living quarters had no kitchen or refrigerator, and no furniture aside from a few plastic chairs and an old mattress. They had to drag water in buckets from a community well, and according to Tass, Louisa's father beat the girls if they talked to boys on their walk back from the well, and they had to watch as he threatened to beat and strangle Helen on almost a daily basis. But through this horrific and traumatic time, Louisa remained smart, quick-witted, and determined. She was fluent in both Arabic and Greek and able to talk to the locals when she and her sister went to the well to get the water. Over a period of time, she was able to introduce her mother to certain local people who knew about their circumstances, and they had friends in high places. Through these contacts, Louisa and Helen were able to form an escape plan to get back to Australia. In the year 2000, they left in the middle of their night while their father was asleep, hiding in the back seats of cars as the rescuers drove them through several guarded checkpoints before reaching the Libyan border. They ventured on through Egypt to Greece, where Helen's family paid for plane tickets to get the girls back to Australia and as far away from their father as possible. At 13, Louisa was finally back in the country she'd grown up in, but the trauma of the 3 years in her father's captivity had left deep mental and psychological wounds on not just her, but her mother too. Helen's fear of being separated from her daughters in the wake of their escape made her a particularly strict parent. Louisa's school friends remember being allowed to sleep over at each other's houses and walk around the town together, but Louisa was only allowed to visit for an hour or two before Helen would take her back home. As most often happens with teenagers, Louisa quickly became disgruntled by her perceived lack of freedom, and she rebelled. Though this rebellious nature did not hinder Louisa in adapting to her new life. She made fast friends with a high school girl named Indigo, who also came from a mixed-race household. Over the next few years, Louisa experimented with her new sense of self. Her friends recalled her always being extremely beautiful and put together. She was glamorous, voluptuous, and strong-willed. She skipped class to play at the pool halls, and she smoked in the school bathrooms. But for all of her world-weary maturity, she was still only a 16-year-old girl. Her desire for independence was constantly at war with her mother's overprotective rules, and as often happens in these instances, Louisa went her own way behind her mother's back. While it's unclear exactly how Louisa met the young man whom her whole adult life would rotate around, Indigo recalls Louisa being absolutely smitten by a man named Joe. This isn't his birth name, but most reports refer to him by the name Joe, so that's how we will be describing him in this episode. Joe was quite a bit older than Louisa, and while this age gap didn't seem to bother her at all, it made her friends curious. Not only did Louisa have many boys her own age vying for her attention, but her friends recalled that Joe seemed mostly disinterested in her in the beginning. They talked sometimes when he was around, but according to Louisa's friend Indigo, it was infrequent. But when Joe did call, Louisa dropped everything for him. Helen was not pleased that her daughter was giving attention to a man in his early 20s and did her best to curb the budding relationship, but Louisa was very headstrong. She often skipped school to hang out with Joe, a ploy that worked until the school reported Louisa's truancy to Helen. The ensuing fight between mother and daughter got so bad that Louisa left and went to Indigo's house, where she lived for almost 3 months. With little access to Joe during this time, Louisa returned to her studies and moved back home during her 11th grade year, repairing her relationship with her mother. But this stability would be short-lived, as by year 12 of her schooling, Louisa had decided to experiment with substances. She dropped out of school completely and joined the club scene, moving out of Helen's home and into a stack house on Chapel Street, near the epicentre of Melbourne's party culture. While living with friends, Louisa got into cannabis, amphetamines and speed. Eventually, she was arrested for an altercation at a nightclub with another woman. She was sentenced to court-ordered volunteer work at a local Greek welfare centre. Louisa had to move back home and she removed herself from the party scene. She then began to stabilise. But not long after moving back in with Helen, Joe and Louisa rekindled their relationship, and Louisa quickly left her mother for a third time to move in with Joe. Though Helen didn't like Joe, she was terrified of losing Louisa completely, and instead offered to have Louisa work with her in her house cleaning business. According to friends and neighbours, the next 2 years were the first stable and good years of their lives since their Libyan nightmare. Louisa and Helen spent their days working together, and they were able to begin to repair their relationship. Indigo described Louisa as incredibly happy during this time, and things finally looked like they were going to stabilise for good. But on New Year's Day of 2009, Louisa's life shattered again. Helen, who had suffered from debilitating asthma for several years, collapsed from a severe asthma attack on her way to the car after attending a friend's New Year's Eve party. She died in the hospital 4 days later, and the security that Louisa had always counted on was gone. Helen's neighbours surrounded Louisa during her time of grief, supporting her as best as they could as she moved back into her mother's apartment, and she became her younger sister's caretaker. But it was all too much for 22-year-old Louisa. As much as she and Helen had fought over the years, her mother had always been her rock, and Louisa was now floundering alone in an ocean of grief. But the world didn't stop for her. There were still bills to pay, Helen's pets to feed, and a younger sister to look after. According to Helen's neighbours, it wasn't long before Joe decided to move in with Louisa to take over running the household. And while they initially thought this was an honourable thing, Joe's presence destroyed the happy, close-knit community that Helen had built with her neighbours. Helen's best friend Kaz described Joe's presence as taking full control of the apartment complex. His friends came and went at all hours of the day and night, disturbing the other families and making them feel unsafe. He was also described by several of them as verbally abusive, and the loud, consistent arguments that bled out of Louisa's household made the once family-friendly block a volatile place. Kaz remembers that Joe and Louisa's sister got into so many fights that Louisa removed her sister from the home to keep her from getting hurt. But according to Louisa's friends, once she and Joe were alone in the apartment, Joe abused Louisa instead. Indigo observed Joe slap Louisa in the face on 2 separate occasions while they were visiting her. She also remembered going to Louisa's house for coffee once, and Helen's parrot Gina, who repeated everything the family said, mimicked Louisa's voice, screaming the phrase, "Stop, Joe, stop." Another family friend observed Joe pushing Louisa and pulling her hair after she asked him to leave her alone. And while Louisa broke up with Joe on several occasions due to this behaviour, as often happens in abusive relationships, they never stayed broken up for long. But in November of 2009, neighbours reported a serious escalation when Joe's verbal abuse was so loud that they feared for Louisa's safety. However, Louisa did not want to give a statement at that time. But Indigo would call the police for a second time only a few months later. On Louisa's birthday in 2010, Indigo went to visit her friend and she was met at the door by Joe. He was shouting profanities about Louisa and stating that all she wanted was drugs and that she wouldn't leave the bedroom. Indigo found her friend in the fetal position on her bed, sobbing. As Indigo comforted her friend, Joe continued to hurl insults and abuse and escalated to hitting both of the women. He also threatened Indigo with a pair of scissors until she left the apartment, and Indigo quickly called authorities. This time, Louisa did make a statement. She documented the physical and verbal abuse that she'd suffered, as well as an instance in which Joe threw boiling water on her and then took her to the hospital for treatment. But though police offered her the option of pressing charges, she declined, citing that she would instead break up with Joe for good. And she did try. She left for a 2-month holiday to visit her grandparents in Greece, in the hopes that the time and distance would bore Joe into finally leaving her alone. But when Louisa returned back to Australia, Joe was waiting for her when her plane touched down in Melbourne. And according to family friends, this marked the beginning of Louisa's end. By 2011, Joe had put himself in charge of all of Louisa's money. He was controlling her phone use and frequently stole her car keys so that she couldn't leave the area without him. Things came to a head in June of 2011 when Louisa called the police herself. She said that Joe had ripped her out of her car by her hair and dragged her across the driveway after he stole her keys because she was trying to leave. She filed charges this time, and Joe was arrested for assault. He made bail and was given a court date for August of 2011, but he never appeared. A warrant was issued for his arrest, but Joe made bail a second time and was reissued another court date for November 15th of 2011. But Louisa would be found dead in the Darebin Creek 3 weeks before his scheduled appearance, making the assault charge null and void. On the afternoon of October 11th, 2011, Louisa's body was spotted floating in the creek, which was around 450 metres away from her apartment. But how she ended up there was a complete mystery. On that afternoon, 2 women walking off-trail in the Parklands Nature Preserve noticed what they originally thought was a large teddy bear that had gotten caught in the branches of a downed tree. Upon closer inspection, they realised it was the badly decomposed body of a young woman. Her hair was flowing in the gently undulating water. Her body was wrapped in a bright pink dressing gown and was half submerged. The other half was stuck against the side of the bank in a bramble. Police were called, and despite Tass putting out a missing persons report for Louisa on October 3rd, it took 8 days after her body was discovered to positively identify her. But once identified, figuring out how she died was difficult. The coroner estimated her time of death was sometime in the night between October 2nd and October 3rd, which meant her body had been in the creek for 8 days before she was found. But had she actually died in that creek? According to the autopsy results, her lungs did not contain any fluid, and there was nothing in any of her organs to suggest that she'd experienced a medical event that would have incapacitated her if she had fallen in. And while her toxicology came back positive for cannabis, the levels were too low to cause any altered states of consciousness that may have led her to lie down under the water. However, investigators found evidence that due to excessive rains the week before she died, the water levels may have been much higher than usual. Her body did not reveal any signs of foul play, and with no signs of a struggle at the scene, the coroner ruled Louisa's death consistent with drowning. But when investigators told this to Tass, he disagreed. To start, Louisa had always been an excellent swimmer. Even if the creek had been unseasonably high, there was no current to drag her under or disorient her, and she wouldn't have had any issues getting back up the bank. She also had no reason to be down at the creek anyway. As far as he knew, and later several of her friends and neighbours would confirm, Louisa had never spent any time in the parklands, and she certainly would never have jumped in the creek. She allegedly found creeks and ponds to be disgusting. Tass believed the only way Louisa could have died in the water was because somebody else put her there. But Victoria Police's investigation did not support Tass's feelings. Despite Joe being an obvious person of interest, police have never considered him as having anything to do with Louisa's death. While several of Louisa's family and friends have found this difficult to swallow, it's important to remember that Joe was well known to the Victorian Police. They had responded to at least 3 calls for Joe perpetrating domestic violence that we know of, and a task force for the prevention of family violence visited Louisa's home twice in the year before her death. To that end, police sought Joe out immediately once Louisa had been identified. And we can assume that they probably had at least some suspicion about him based on the pending sexual assault charge and the past calls for domestic violence. But in his interview with police, Joe stated that he'd actually broken up with Louisa on the afternoon of October 2nd. At around 9:45 p.m. that night, he'd returned to her apartment because he forgot his work keys. He claimed that Louisa had confronted him and they had a minor disagreement. He said he left her alone after this and went out to the yard to play with their dog. When he turned to go back inside, he said the front door was wide open and Louisa was gone. He ran down the street and glanced left at the intersection of their street and Tyler Street. He claimed he could just make out Louisa's pink dressing gown, illuminated by the singular streetlight, as she ran towards the entrance to the parklands. He decided that she probably wanted to be alone and went back to the apartment to wait for her to come back. He fell asleep at some point, and when he woke up the next morning, Louisa was still not home. Afterwards, he claimed he took the dog for a walk down to the parklands to look for Louisa. At one point, he spotted her pink dressing gown snagged on some branches in the creek, but he said he didn't get close enough to really look. He figured she'd thrown it into the creek as she ran, and after finding no sign of her on the trails, he went back to the apartment and called Tass to say that Louisa was missing. Joe was allegedly cooperative with police, including letting them into the apartment and giving them Louisa's diary, in the hopes that it might contain any clues about what had happened to her. Investigators found no evidence to suggest that Joe or anyone else had anything to do with Louisa's death. But once again, Tass did not agree. While he didn't necessarily believe that Joe killed his sister, he also didn't feel like any of the evidence matched up. After burying Louisa, Tass spent the next several years trying to get her case reopened as a homicide. But overturning a coroner's ruling is next to impossible in most cases, and after almost a decade of exhausting his own resources, Tass turned to private investigator Julia Robson in the hopes that she may be able to uncover some new leads. Robson began her re-examination of Louisa's case in 2022, and she uncovered several inconsistencies which she laid out in her podcast titled Troubled Waters. She broke Louisa's death down into 3 potential possibilities: accidental death, suicide, or homicide, and she sifted through the available evidence to see how closely it fit each choice. After her investigation, Robson did not believe that Louisa had drowned. Despite there being high levels of rain reported the week before Louisa's body was found, environmental research and readings from the creek for the day of her death showed that the creek's levels were actually quite low, and even the deepest areas would only have been at Louisa's thighs. The water was not cold enough to produce shock or cardiac issues that may have incapacitated her in the shallow water. The cannabis in her system wouldn't have been enough to make her disoriented, and she had no known health issues that may have inhibited her from standing up and getting back up onto the bank. The autopsy also showed no signs that she'd had head trauma from hitting a rock as she'd fallen in. So, if it hadn't been accidental, then Louisa had either entered the water with the intent to die or someone had put her in there. Robson interviewed many of Louisa's friends, family and neighbours, none of whom remembered Louisa verbalising any desire to end her own life. And the diary that Joe had given to police didn't show any evidence of suicidal thoughts either. But some parts of Louisa's last day of life may have contributed to her feeling like she had no other options. As I discussed earlier, Louisa and Joe's relationship was reportedly violent, and several experts have suggested that Joe utilised coercive control to trap Louisa. Robson found that the last day that Louisa was seen alive, neighbours claimed the two had gotten into a brutal fight early in the morning, and after the fight, Joe had driven away in Louisa's car. At around 1 p.m, Louisa packed an overnight bag and asked a neighbour for a ride to the Melbourne airport, even though she had no money and no phone. No one is quite sure what Louisa was planning to do, as she had no travel plans that anyone knew of. But at around 2 p.m, she hailed a taxi outside of the airport and begged the driver to take her home even though she couldn't pay. When interviewed by Robson, the taxi driver claimed that Louisa was sobbing and asked to use his phone to call someone to pay the fare. He dropped her off at a service station where Joe was waiting for her. The driver overheard her tell Joe that she'd been trying to go overseas. We can surmise that this probably meant she was trying to get to Greece, which was the same place she'd gone the last time she'd broken up with him. In Robson's investigation, witnesses told her that Joe had a friend with him when he picked up Louisa. This friend claimed they drove to the home of Louisa's drug dealer, a man named George. Louisa went inside to buy methamphetamines and Joe waited in the car with his friend. After Louisa returned around 10 minutes later, Joe became angry and said that Louisa was providing her drug dealer with sexual favours in exchange for drugs. In a fit of anger, his friend claimed that Joe got out of the car and busted out the window of George's vehicle before getting back into the car and driving them all back to Louisa's apartment. At around 4:30 p.m, neighbours told Robson that Louisa and Joe were having a heated argument as they exited the car and went into the apartment. At some point, Joe drove away in Louisa's car again, leaving her alone. And at 8:45 p.m, Louisa knocked on a neighbour's door asking to borrow their phone. At this time, the neighbour noticed that Louisa had blood in her hair near her ear, and they assumed that Joe had physically assaulted her. Phone records revealed that Louisa called Joe before returning to her apartment. This would be the last time that the neighbours saw her. In weighing the events of the final hours, Robson questioned if Louisa's failure at leaving the country and only ending up back at her apartment with Joe may have caused her to feel that drowning herself in the creek was her only way out of the horrible situation. However, experts in aquatic deaths disagreed with this theory, based on the shallow depths of the creek and the fact that Louisa had no water in her lungs or her stomach at the time of her autopsy. If she had died by drowning, both organs should have had some level of water in them. This leaves one option that truly hasn't been explored: homicide. While Victorian police still don't have reasonable evidence to suggest that Joe murdered Louisa, Robson has questioned how well his story has been corroborated. His story about breaking up with Louisa in the afternoon seems to fall apart under the weight of other witness statements. He also never mentioned to police about picking Louisa up from the taxi or taking her to George's house the day before she disappeared. But these instances were corroborated by several other witnesses. Robson wonders why Joe did not include these details. Neighbours claimed that they did not see Joe walking the dog down to the creek the morning after Louisa disappeared as he had told police, but they had noticed that Louisa's car was missing around the time he was allegedly looking for her. Police records also indicate that Joe made a call to George at around 2 a.m. after Louisa allegedly ran to the creek, even though he told police he'd been asleep all night. He also had that pending assault charge at the time of her disappearance, and Louisa had been categorised as an at-risk person for domestic abuse by the Darebin Centre for Family Violence. As far as Robson could find, Joe was never able to give police any definitive times for when he'd fallen asleep, the night that Louisa allegedly ran to the creek, or when he woke up to find her missing the next morning. But despite all of these inconsistencies, Louisa's body showed no signs of violent trauma in her autopsy, and according to Tass, the police told him that Joe had provided them with a very strong alibi. It's very possible that despite Robson's exhaustive investigation, Joe's alibi and other corroborative evidence has not been made available to her or to the public. But while Robson may have not had access to everything, her 10-part podcast on Louisa's case garnered enormous public attention. Tass and Robson were also featured on Australian Story in September of 2025 to promote the podcast and Louisa's story. Following the special and the podcast, Louisa's family started a petition, urging the Victorian Coroner's Office to revisit Louisa's cause of death. It received over 18,000 signatures from the public, and to the family's relief and surprise, in November of 2025, the coroner agreed to reopen Louisa's case. As of the time of recording this episode, the case is currently being reinvestigated by Victorian law enforcement, and we will keep an eye on any updates as they come in. We hope this will be a path to justice for Louisa, and that her family will finally get answers to the unexplainable way that they lost their loved one. For any listeners who want to take a deeper dive into Louisa's story, I highly recommend tuning into the Julia Robson podcast titled Troubled Waters, which provided most of the information for today's episode. Other resources for today's episode include the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, or ABC, Find a Grave, mamamia.com, Media Week, and the Parliament of Victoria. Thank you for listening. We'd love for you to follow us on social media. We're on every major platform, so search for us on your favourites, and we'll be sure to include links in the show notes. You can also find us on our website, belowthesurfacepodcast.net. If you'd like to show your support for this show and get your episodes early and ad-free, consider an AbJack Insider subscription through Apple Podcasts. For only $4.99 a month or $49.99 a year, not only will you get early and ad-free access to this show, but to every show on the AbJack network of shows. To get started, just head over to Apple Podcasts and search for the AbJack Entertainment channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Finally, we'd very much appreciate you leaving a rating or review on the platform you're listening to us now on. This will really help us grow and it helps new listeners to find the show. And please tell your friends about Below the Surface. Nothing beats word of mouth. We will see you back in 2 weeks with an all-new episode. Thank you all so much.
Below the Surface is hosted and narrated by Olivia McKenzie, with research and writing by Abigail Belcastro, and it's produced by Mike Morford for AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to join us for the next episode of Below the Surface.